Welcome, dear listeners, to this cozy audiobook adventure, Miss Marple and the Lace-Making Clue. Join the inimitable Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a gentle puzzle in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead. Settle in with a cup of tea and let the mystery unfold. This story is narrated in the classic style of Agatha Christie, full of wit, observation, and a touch of village charm. Our tale begins now. Chapter 1. The Quiet Cottage. The summer of 1952 had settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft muslin cloth, warm, slightly hazy, and scented with honeysuckle that drifted in through every open window. In the little house called Mead, halfway along the lane that curved toward the church, Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair beside the French windows, her steel knitting needles moving with the unhurried certainty of long practice. A ball of pale lilac wool rested in her lap, and the garment taking shape beneath her fingers was intended, she had decided, for the baby of young Mrs. Dane Calthrop at the vicarage, though the vicar's wife was not yet aware that she was expecting. Miss Marple usually knew these things a little before anyone else. Outside, the garden drowsed. Roses nodded over the path, the lawn was newly scythed, and the air held that particular stillness that comes in an English village just after luncheon, when most people are dozing behind drawn curtains and even the dogs have given up barking. Only the bees moved with any purpose, droning among the lavender. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, gentle and seemingly vague, rested now and then on the street beyond her gate. Very little happened in St. Mary Mead that escaped her notice, though she was far too polite to say so. At 20 minutes past 2, the peace was broken by the brisk clip-clop of heels on the pavement and the swish of a flowered cotton skirt. Mrs. Dolly Bantry appeared at the gate, hat slightly askew, cheeks pink with haste and agitation. She was a handsome, rather scatterbrained woman who had never quite grown used to the fact that her husband, Colonel Bantry, preferred fishing to society. Today she carried no fishing rod, only a larm. Miss Marple laid her knitting carefully on the little table beside her, marking the row with a mother-of-pearl counter, and rose to open the door before Dolly had time to knock. "My dear Dolly," she said in her soft, precise voice, "do come in and sit down. You look quite overheated. May I give you a glass of barley water?" Dolly swept in like a frigate under full sail. "Jane, it's too dreadful. I've just come from Ivy Lane End. Old Mrs. Threadgood is dead." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes grew a fraction keener. "Dead? Dear me, I saw her only yesterday morning at the post office. She seemed perfectly well, complained as usual that the new stamps were not properly gummed." "That's just it!" Dolly sank into the chintz-covered sofa and fanned herself with her handkerchief. "She was perfectly well yesterday, and this morning poor Miss Paulet found her stone cold in her armchair, still holding her lace pillow. The teacup smashed on the floor, lace bobbins scattered everywhere. Oh, it's all most distressing." Miss Marple poured barley water into a tall glass and handed it across. "Pray begin at the beginning, Dolly dear. Who is Miss Paulet, and why was she at Mrs. Threadgood's cottage so early?" "Miss Paulet goes in 3 mornings a week to do the rough," Dolly explained, gulping the cool liquid gratefully. "She has a key. She let herself in at 8:30 as usual, called out, 'Good morning, ma'am,' and when there was no answer, she went through to the sitting room. There was Mrs. Threadgood, head fallen forward, her needle still in the lace, and the whole room smelling faintly of bitter almonds, only of course it can't have been bitter almonds because that would mean—" "Prussic acid," Miss Marple finished quietly. "Though Dr. Haydock will tell us soon enough whether that was the case. Pray go on." Dolly needed no encouragement. Miss Paulet screamed naturally and ran straight to fetch Constable Slack, who telephoned Dr. Haydock. The doctor came at once and said it was heart failure. Mrs. Threadgood had a weak heart, you know, but he looked very grave. And then that nephew of hers turned up, Reginald, the one from London with the loud ties, and began demanding to see the will, and Miss Polet heard him say something about not a moment too soon. "Jane, do you suppose he—" "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple said mildly, "we must not suppose anything until we know a great deal more. People very often say things they do not mean when they are upset. Tell me, was the front door locked when Miss Polet arrived?" "On the latch," she says. "Mrs. Threadgood always left it so for her on cleaning mornings. But the back door was bolted from the inside and all the windows were fastened. So whoever, well, if anyone, nobody could have got in or out, could they?" Miss Marple considered this, her small, delicately wrinkled hands folded in her lap. "Mrs. Threadgood lived alone, did she not? Apart from the cat, I mean, dear little Sootikin. Quite alone since old Miss Threadgood died 5 years ago. She was the last of the family except for that nephew, and he only visited when he wanted money. Everyone knows that." There was a pause. Outside, a blackbird began to sing from the apple tree. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the garden, but her mind was busy arranging facts the way another woman might arrange flowers in a vase. "Was anything out of place?" she asked presently. Dolly frowned in an effort of memory. "Miss Polet says the lace pillow had slipped to the floor and there were bobbins everywhere, dozens of them scattered like spillikins. And the teapot was still warm. She'd only just made herself a cup, you see, and then, well, dropped it." "Dear me," murmured Miss Marple. "How very sad. And the lace she was working on. Still pinned to the pillow, half finished. One of her butterfly patterns, Miss Polet thinks. She was entering it for the fete next week. Everyone said it would be sure to take first prize again." Miss Marple nodded. Mrs. Evelyn Threadgood had been the undisputed queen of lace-making in St. Mary Mead for 40 years. Her bobbins, turned from pear wood and hung with tiny glass beads that tinkled like fairy bells, were famous throughout the county. Each year at the summer fete, her entries swept the board. Honiton, Bucks Point, Bruges bloomwork, all executed with a precision that made younger women despair. "Such a loss to the village," Miss Marple said softly. "She was a true artist." Dolly leaned forward, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial hush reserved for scandal. "But Jane, there's more. Young Emily Barton. You know, the quiet little thing who was apprenticed to her, called on me just now in floods of tears. She says Mrs. Threadgood had been worried lately. Kept saying someone was interfering with her threads. And only last week she told Emily that if anything happened to her, we were all to look very carefully at the last piece of lace she made. That there would be a message in it." "A message?" Miss Marple's white eyebrows rose a fraction. "Emily thought she was wandering. Old ladies do, you know, but now, well, it does sound ominous, doesn't it?" Miss Marple did not reply at once. She rose and moved to the window, looking out at the sunlit street where nothing stirred except a tortoiseshell cat washing itself on a wall. In her mind she saw the small, tidy sitting room at Ivy Lane End, the gate-legged table with its load of bobbins, the lace pillow on its adjustable stand, the spool rack on the wall, the little shelf of pattern books, the armchair drawn close to the window for the best light. A peaceful room, a safe room, and yet death had entered it quietly between one sip of tea and the next. "I think," she said at last, turning back to Dolly, "that I should like to pay my respects. Perhaps Dr. Haydock will permit me to see poor Evelyn for a moment. One likes to remember people as they were." Dolly looked doubtful. "Constable Slack is fearfully officious. He's got it into his head that it's a case, though the doctor says there's no question of anything but natural causes." Miss Marple gave a small, understanding smile. "Constable Slack is very young," she observed. "Youth is apt to see drama where there is only sorrow. All the same, I believe I shall put on my hat." 20 minutes later, the two ladies were walking sedately down the lane toward Ivy Lane End. Miss Marple wore a dove-gray cotton dress, a straw hat trimmed with violets, and carried a parasol against the sun. Dolly, still flushed with excitement, chattered as they went, but Miss Marple's responses grew, gentler and fewer. Her eyes, behind their slightly magnifying spectacles, noted everything. The fresh wheel marks of a bicycle outside the drapers, the new curtain material in Miss Hartnell's window, the way Mr. Elliot the gardener paused to touch his cap as they passed. Ivy Lane End stood a little apart from its neighbors, surrounded by a garden riotous with old-fashioned flowers. Sweet williams, peonies, love in a mist. The cottage itself was small and perfect, its walls washed pale pink, its thatch thick and neatly clipped. Wisteria framed the front door. On an ordinary day, it looked like the illustration to a fairy tale. Today, the door stood ajar and Constable Slack's bicycle leaned against the gate. The constable himself appeared as they approached, red-faced and bursting with importance. "Now, ladies, this is no place for sightseeing. Doctor's orders, nobody to go in till the ambulance comes." Miss Marple regarded him with mild surprise. "Dear Constable Slack, Mrs. Bantry and I have come to offer whatever help we can in this sad hour." Poor Mrs. Threadgood was a very old acquaintance. Slack wavered. Authority sat uneasily on his broad shoulders when confronted by elderly gentlewomen of unmistakable refinement. "Well, just for a minute, then. But mind you don't touch anything." They stepped into the narrow hall, cool and smelling of beeswax and lavender. To the left, the sitting-room door stood open. Miss Marple paused on the threshold. Evelyn Threadgood sat upright in her high-backed chair, head drooped forward, one thin hand still resting on the lace pillow in her lap. Her white hair was neatly pinned, her lilac wool dress smooth and tidy. Only the staring eyes and the faint bluish tinge about her lips spoke of the violence that had overtaken her. On the floor beside her lay a shattered cup and saucer. Royal Albert, Miss Marple noted automatically, the pink rose pattern, and a dark stain spread across the faded Persian rug. Bobbins lay scattered like tiny ninepins, their glass beads catching stray glints of sunlight. Dr. Haydock was bending over the body, stethoscope still in his ears. He straightened as the ladies entered and gave a small, weary nod. "Heart failure," he said briefly. "I warned her to take things easier, but she would keep at that everlasting lace. Excitement, possibly, on top of the strain." Miss Marple moved quietly forward until she stood beside the chair. She did not touch the dead woman, but her gaze traveled slowly over the scene. The teapot cozy embroidered with violets, the plate of untouched Marie biscuits, the lace itself, half a delicate butterfly taking shape under pins no thicker than hairs. "How beautiful," she murmured. "Even in the midst of sorrow, one must admire such skill." Dr. Haydock gave a short, sad laugh. She was finishing it for the fete, said it would be her masterpiece. Miss Marple bent a little closer. The pattern was indeed exquisite, the threads so fine they seemed spun from moonlight. And yet, something caught her attention. One section near the wing of the butterfly appeared slightly puckered, as though a stitch had been dropped and taken up again differently. A very small thing, a thing no one else would notice. She straightened, her face serene. "Thank you, Doctor. I shall not trouble you further. Come, Dolly." Outside in the sunshine once more, Dolly exploded. "Well, did you see anything?" Miss Marple twirled her parasol thoughtfully. "I saw a great many things, my dear. Whether any of them matter remains to be seen. But I should like to speak to Emily Barton as soon as may be. And perhaps to Reginald Threadgood, if he can be prevailed upon to be civil." Dolly stared. "You don't think, Jane, you can't believe it was anything but natural?" Miss Marple's eyes rested on a bed of love in a mist, its delicate blue flowers trembling in the breeze. My dear, in a village one learns never to believe anything is entirely natural until one is quite sure. People are not always what they seem, and even the gentlest hearts can conceal surprising secrets. But come, we will take a cup of tea at the Blue Boar and see what the village is saying. Gossip, you know, is often the truest form of history. And with that mild observation, she set off down the lane, her parasol tilted against the sun, leaving Dolly to hurry after her. Half scandalized, half thrilled, and wholly certain that something quite out of the ordinary had begun in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. The suspects emerge. By the following morning, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead as thoroughly as butter on hot toast, and the little cottage at Ivy Lane End had become the center of a respectful but insatiable curiosity. A small knot of villagers lingered by the gate, murmuring in low voices, while Constable Slack stood guard with the air of a man who has at last been given a murder whether anyone else believes in it or not. Dr. Haydock's motor car was drawn up on the grass verge, and from the open front door came the occasional clink of crockery as Miss Powlett, fortified by strong tea and a sense of occasion, washed the undrunk cups and restored order under the doctor's tolerant eye. Miss Marple, arriving at 9:45 with a small bunch of white pinks from her own garden, was admitted without demur. Elderly ladies bearing flowers were clearly not considered dangerous. Inside, the sitting room had been tidied, the rug taken up to hide the tea stain, and Mrs. Threadgood herself removed to her bed upstairs, decently composed beneath a lace-edged sheet that was, ironically, one of her own earliest pieces. Dr. Haydock greeted Miss Marple with a weary smile. "I've telephoned the coroner's officer. Post-mortem this afternoon, inquest tomorrow. Purely formal, of course." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Between ourselves, Jane, there's a faint suggestion of something irregular. Traces of a bitter principle in the stomach contents. But it may be medicine. She took digitalis, you know." Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. Poor Evelyn. One hears such sad stories of accidental overdose, though she was always so careful. She laid the pinks in a vase on the mantelpiece beside a photograph of Mrs. Threadgood at the 1935 county show receiving yet another silver cup. "May I see the lace pillow? I promised Emily Barton I would look at the butterfly pattern. She is anxious it should be finished for the fete in her teacher's memory." Dr. Haydock waved a permissive hand toward the gate-legged table where the pillow still rested, now neatly covered with a square of muslin. Miss Marple lifted the cloth with gentle reverence. The half-made butterfly lay exactly as death had left it, the pins gleaming like tiny silver arrows. She bent closer, adjusting her spectacles. The puckered place she had noticed yesterday was still there. A minute irregularity near the lower wing. 3 threads twisted where only 2 should lie, forming the faintest bump in the otherwise flawless ground. To the ordinary eye it was nothing. To Miss Marple it was as eloquent as a shouted confession. She made no remark, however, only sighed and replaced the muslin. At that moment the door opened to admit Reginald Threadgood, city suit slightly rumpled, loud tie askew, smelling faintly of brandy taken to steady the nerves. He was a thick-set man of 35, with his aunt's prominent nose but none of her refinement. "Doctor," he began without preamble, "I must insist on seeing my aunt's papers. There's a will and as next of kin—" Dr. Haydock's face hardened. "Everything is in order, Mr. Threadgood. The solicitor, Mr. Curtis, has the will. I believe you will find it provides for certain eventualities." Reginald flushed darkly. "You mean she left everything to charity, I suppose? After all the money after I was her only relative?" Miss Marple turned from the table, her voice as soft as thistledown. Your aunt was a woman of strong principle, Mr. Threadgood. She often said blood was not the only tie that mattered. He glared at her, recognized the harmless old lady from the village, and dismissed her with a snort. I shall contest it, of course, and I want her workbox locked until the valuation is made. Some of those antique bobbins are worth a fortune. He strode toward the table, but Constable Slack appeared as if by magic and planted himself in the way. Nothing to be touched, sir, till after the inquest. Reginald swore under his breath and stamped out again, slamming the door so hard that the lace pillow trembled on its stand. Dr. Haydock rubbed his forehead. Unpleasant fellow. Came down last week asking for a loan, £500 for some shady company flotation. She refused point blank. They had quite a scene in the garden. Half the village heard it. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And yet she invited him to stay until after the fete. Curious. From the kitchen came the sound of a sob quickly suppressed. Emily Barton stood in the doorway, pale and red-eyed, clutching a parcel wrapped in tissue. She was a slight creature of 22 with soft brown hair and the anxious expression of a rabbit that has heard the gun clicked too often. I brought her patterns, she whispered. She wanted me to have them. Oh, Miss Marple, I can't believe she's gone. Miss Marple took the girl's cold hands in her own warm ones. My dear, you must be brave. Your teacher would wish her work to go on. She led Emily to the table and uncovered the butterfly once more. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual about this piece when you last saw it on Friday? Emily bent over the lace, blinking away tears. Only that she was working so quickly. She said she must finish before something happened. And look, her finger hovered above the puckered spot. That's not like her. She would never have left a twisted thread. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening, gave a short, embarrassed cough. Well, old ladies do get shaky fingers sometimes. No need to read mysteries into everything. But Miss Marple's gaze had sharpened. Perhaps not. And yet Evelyn Threadgood's fingers were never shaky. I have seen her work torch-on lace by candlelight without a single error. At that moment the door opened again to admit Miss Lydia Croft, angular, 50-ish, dressed in pepper and salt tweed despite the heat, and carrying a large reticule that clinked ominously. Miss Croft had been second only to Mrs. Threadgood in the lace-making hierarchy for 2 decades and had never quite forgiven the fact. I've come for the Women's Institute display samples, she announced. Poor Evelyn would have wished the show to go on. Her sharp glance darted round the room, resting with ill-concealed triumph on the covered pillow. Though I dare say my own entry will take the cup this year. Emily flushed crimson. Dr. Haydock looked annoyed. Miss Marple merely smiled. Competition is the lifeblood of craft, Miss Croft, though I always feel that true artistry needs no prize to validate it. Miss Croft gave a snort that might have been laughter and swept out again, leaving behind a faint smell of violet brilliantine and unsatisfied ambition. When the door closed, Dr. Haydock exhaled heavily. Between the nephew wanting money, the apprentice wanting patterns, and Lydia Croft wanting glory, poor Evelyn didn't have much peace in her last days. Miss Marple replaced the muslin over the butterfly with gentle finality. Peace, she repeated softly, is not always granted to those who possess something others desire. And Evelyn Threadgood possessed a great deal more than most people realized. She took her leave soon afterward, pausing on the doorstep to exchange a word with Constable Slack, who was still attempting to look like Scotland Yard in a helmet 2 sizes too large. You will let me know, Constable, if anything unusual should emerge from the post-mortem? Slack touched his helmet, half flattered, half suspicious. Can't say yet, miss, but there's something queer about it, mark my words. Miss Marple walked slowly homeward beneath her parasol, her mind turning over the morning's impressions like a hand of patience. Reginald's greed, Emily's grief, Lydia Croft's malice, Dr. Haydock's carefully professional manner, and above all that tiny twisted thread in the butterfly's wing that should not have been there at all. By the time she reached her own gate, she was almost certain that the inquest tomorrow would be a great deal more than a formality, and that St. Mary Mead, so peaceful beneath its summer sun, had become the stage for a drama as delicate and as deadly as the finest lace. Chapter 3. Tea and Whispers. The afternoon post carried the official notice of the inquest, but long before the postman reached the last cottage in St. Mary Mead, the village had already settled upon its own verdict. Poor Mrs. Threadgood had been taken sudden, and that was that. Yet beneath the polite murmurings ran a quieter current of speculation, the kind that gathers over teacups and garden walls when no one is supposed to be listening. Miss Marple, who listened more carefully than anyone suspected, accepted 3 separate invitations to tea that day, knowing full well that each hostess wished to be the first to tell her what she already knew, and to discover what she might have noticed that they had not. She began with Mrs. Dane Calthrop at the vicarage, where the drawing-room windows stood open to the scent of Philadelphus, and the vicar himself was safely occupied in the churchyard practicing the organ for Sunday. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, tall, untidy, and invariably kind, pressed a large slice of seed cake upon her guest and plunged straight in. "Jane, my dear, it is all most disturbing. Evelyn Threadgood came to see Leonard only last Thursday, sat in this very chair, and spoke of making a new will. She said she feared she might not have long, and there were things she wished to put right. Leonard told her she was overtired, but she insisted the codicil be witnessed at once. He signed it himself, and so did I, though I have no idea what it contained. She took it away with her in that little green dispatch case she always carried." Miss Marple sipped her tea, which was strong and exactly as she liked it. "A codicil is a serious matter. Did she seem afraid?" "Not afraid precisely, determined. She said something odd, that certain people would be disappointed, but charity began at home, and she had waited long enough to see where true affection lay. Then she laughed rather bitterly, and said the lace would tell the rest." Miss Marple's cup paused halfway to her lips. "The lace. Those were her words. When I am gone, the lace will speak plainly enough. I thought she meant she had left instructions with her patterns, but now—" "Jane, do you suppose she knew someone meant her harm?" Miss Marple set the cup down with care. "People who feel threatened sometimes express themselves strangely. Tell me, did she mention any names?" "Only one, Reginald. She said blood was thicker than water, but water was cleaner. Poor Leonard was quite shocked." From the vicarage, Miss Marple walked the short distance to Gossington Hall, where Dolly Bantry, having recovered from yesterday's excitement, was now in the grip of a fresh one. She met Miss Marple at the door in a state of breathless triumph. "Jane, the most extraordinary thing. Colonel Bantry's old friend Sir Henry Clithering is coming down tomorrow for the inquest. He's staying the night. He telephoned this morning. Apparently Scotland Yard has taken an interest after all. Something about the post-mortem." Miss Marple received this news with a gentle nod. "Sir Henry is always interested when there is a puzzle, and there is certainly a puzzle here." Dolly drew her into the morning room and shut the door with conspiratorial emphasis. "Listen to this. Polk the gardener was clipping the churchyard hedge yesterday afternoon, and he distinctly heard Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Threadgood quarreling in her garden the day before she died. Raised voices, something about debts and honor. Polk couldn't catch all of it, but the doctor drove off in a fury." Miss Marple considered. Dr. Haydock had attended the Threadgood family for 30 years. A quarrel suggested something deeper than a disputed bill. "Doctors do sometimes become involved in their patients' affairs," she murmured. especially when large sums are concerned. Dolly's eyes widened. You mean he lent her money, or she lent him? Money has a way of complicating affection, Miss Marple said mildly, but let us not leap ahead of the facts. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Hartnell and Miss Weatherby, both agog with fresh intelligence. Miss Hartnell, upright and militant, announced that she had it on the best authority, Mrs. Price Ridley's maid sister who helped at the surgery, that Dr. Haydock had been seen burning papers in his surgery stove only yesterday. Miss Weatherby, softer and rounder, added in a thrilled whisper that Emily Barton had been sent a registered parcel that very morning, posted by Mrs. Threadgood the day before her death. By the time Miss Marple left Gossington Hall, the sun was declining, and the long shadows of the elms stretched across the village green like fingers pointing toward hidden truths. She paused at the post office to buy 2 pennies worth of stamps she did not need, and while Mrs. Blade wrapped them with deliberate slowness, the postmistress imparted her own offering. That nephew was in here yesterday morning, Miss Marple, asking if his aunt had sent any letters lately. Looked ever so put out when I said there was nothing for him. And Miss Croft bought a penny stamp at the same time. Said she was writing to the Lacemakers Guild about entering a new category now that Mrs. Threadgood wouldn't be competing. Miss Marple thanked her gravely and continued on her way, turning at last into the narrow footpath that led to Emily Barton's tiny cottage behind the school. Emily herself opened the door, eyes still swollen but with a touching attempt at composure. I was coming to see you, Miss Marple. She left me this. She held out the registered parcel, now unwrapped. Inside lay the green dispatch case from the vicarage, together with a single sheet of notepaper in Mrs. Threadgood's spidery handwriting. My dear child, if you read this, I shall be gone. Guard the butterfly. The message is for those with eyes to see. Do not trust appearances. Your loving teacher, E.T. Emily's voice trembled. There was no new will inside, only the old one, leaving everything to Reginald except her lace tools and patterns, which come to me. But the butterfly is still at the cottage. Constable Slack won't let me fetch it. Miss Marple took the girl's hand. We will ask Sir Henry Clithering tomorrow. He is an old friend and will listen to us. In the meantime, my dear, say nothing of this note to anyone. There are already too many people in St. Mary Mead trying to read a message intended for one pair of eyes alone. Twilight was deepening as Miss Marple walked home, the air cool now and full of the scent of stocks and nicotiana from cottage gardens. In the hush, she could almost hear the village holding its breath, waiting for the inquest to pronounce upon a death that no one, in their hearts, quite believed had been natural. 4 names circled in her mind like moths around a candle. Reginald Threadgood, greedy and desperate. Dr. Haydock, burdened by some secret anxiety. Lydia Croft, eaten by years of envious second place. And gentle Emily Barton, who had loved her teacher too much perhaps to be entirely above suspicion. And above them all hovered the image of a half-finished butterfly of lace, its lower wing marred by one deliberate twist of thread that formed, to those who could read the language of torment and warning, the tiny, almost invisible shape of a single letter. Miss Marple closed her gate behind her, drew the curtains against the night, and sat down beside her little fire, though the evening was mild. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was also drawing curtains, perhaps telling himself that an old woman's death would be forgotten by next week's fete. He, or she, had forgotten that in villages nothing is ever forgotten, and that even the finest lace stretched upon its pillow holds every knot and every twist for those patient enough to look. Chapter 4. A False Thread. The inquest was held in the parish room at 11 o'clock on a morning so bright that the light seemed almost indecent, pouring through the high windows and laying merciless stripes across the trestle table where the coroner sat. Half the village had found urgent reasons to be present. The benches were packed tight, and latecomers stood 3 deep at the back, fanning themselves with hymn sheets left over from Sunday. Miss Marple, seated between Dolly Bantry and a subdued Emily Barton, appeared the picture of elderly calm, her gray gloves folded neatly in her lap, yet nothing escaped the pale flicker of her eyes. Dr. Haydock gave evidence first, precise and professional, his voice betraying nothing beyond regret. Death, he said, had been caused by acute cardiac failure, accelerated by the presence in the blood of a significant quantity of arsenic, enough to kill, though administered, he thought, in small doses over several days. The coroner raised an eyebrow at the word administered. The doctor conceded that the poison might have entered the body through the skin, perhaps on the points of pins repeatedly handled. A murmur rippled through the room like wind across wheat. Constable Slack, swelling with importance, described finding the lace pillow, the scattered bobbins, the broken cup. He produced a small twist of paper containing 3 pins whose tips, when tested at the county laboratory, had shown distinct traces of white arsenic. The room grew very still. Miss Marple noticed Reginald Threadgood in the front row turn the color of tallow. Reginald's own evidence was brief and unconvincing. He had arrived in the village on Thursday, intending to spend a few days with his aunt. They had discussed money, she had refused a loan, voices had been raised. He had spent Friday evening at the Blue Boar playing darts, and had returned to the cottage at 11 to find her already asleep. On Saturday morning he had breakfasted early and walked to Much Benham to catch the London train, only returning when summoned by telegram. The landlord of the Blue Boar confirmed the darts, though he could not swear to the exact time Reginald left. The station master at Much Benham remembered no passenger answering Reginald's description on the Saturday morning train. Reginald grew red, muttered about missing it and taking a later one, and sat down abruptly. Lydia Croft followed, upright and defiant. She had called upon Mrs. Threadgood on Friday afternoon to borrow a rare pattern book and had been refused with unnecessary sharpness. She had left in a temper at 4:30 and spent the rest of the evening marking examination papers for the Women's Institute Handicraft Certificate. 10 ladies could confirm she had not left her cottage. She added acidly that she had no need of poison to beat Evelyn Threadgood. This year her own torchon lace would have won on merit. A titter ran round the room, hastily suppressed. Emily Barton, trembling, told how she had worked with her teacher until 6 o'clock on Friday, tidying the lace cupboard and winding fresh thread onto bobbins. Mrs. Threadgood had been tired but not unwell. She had spoken of finishing the butterfly that night because time was running short. Emily had taken away a bundle of old patterns as instructed and had not returned until after the tragedy. She broke down and had to be led away. The coroner brought in a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, adjourned the inquest sine die, and the room emptied slowly into the blinding sunshine, everyone talking at once. Outside on the steps, Sir Henry Clithering, lean, courteous, and unmistakably Scotland Yard even in mufti, greeted Miss Marple with real pleasure. "My dear Jane, I rather thought I should find you in the thick of it. Haydock telephoned me last night. The arsenic on the pins decided him. Walk with me to the cottage, will you? I want to see this famous butterfly." They strolled together down the lane, Sir Henry listening while Miss Marple recounted in her quiet, precise way everything she had observed. At Ivy Lane End, Constable Slack had been replaced by a young sergeant who touched his cap respectfully and admitted them without fuss. The sitting room looked much as it had on the morning of the death, save that the lace pillow now stood on the table uncovered, the butterfly gleaming like frost under the strong light. Sir Henry bent over it. "Exquisite work. And you say there is a message?" Miss Marple indicated the tiny puckering on the lower wing. "To the ordinary eye, a fault. But look closely, Henry. 3 threads twisted instead of 2, then carried forward in a different sequence. In the old lacemaker's code, Flemish, I believe, though Evelyn used a variation, it forms the letter D. D, Sir Henry repeated. Doctor, debts, despair? Or simply a warning, Miss Marple said softly. Evelyn Threadgood was trying to tell us who had reason to wish her dead, but she was interrupted before she could finish. Sir Henry straightened. Then the field is wide. Half the village might be said to begin with D. Dane Calthrop, Dolly Bantry, even my own driver is called Dixon. Still, it is something. And these pins... He took the small envelope the sergeant handed him, tipping the 3 deadly pins onto a sheet of white paper. Ingenious. A prick or 2 each day would scarcely be noticed, yet the poison would accumulate. Someone who had access to her workroom over a period of weeks. Someone she trusted, Miss Marple added. They were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock himself, looking strained. He greeted Sir Henry with the wary courtesy of a man who knows his evidence has set the hounds running. I came to collect my bag. I left it here yesterday. You'll want to search the cottage, of course. Already done, Sir Henry said pleasantly. Nothing helpful, I'm afraid. Though we did find a bottle of weed killer in the garden, shed containing arsenic. The label says it was bought last spring by Miss Croft for the churchyard paths. Dr. Haydock's face cleared a little. Lydia Croft? Well, there's your poisoner, surely. Everyone knows she hated Evelyn. Everyone knows, Miss Marple murmured, is not the same as everyone proves. The doctor gave her a sharp glance, then picked up his bag and left. Sir Henry watched him go. He's worried? Debts, perhaps? Or something more personal? Miss Marple did not answer directly. She was looking at the lace pillow again, her head tilted like a bird's. Henry, may I borrow this for an hour? Only to my own house. I promise to return it untouched. Sir Henry hesitated, then smiled. On your own recognizance, Jane, but no longer. Back in her sunny parlor, Miss Marple set the pillow on her small table beneath the window, drew up a chair, and for 20 minutes studied the butterfly through a magnifying glass, strenuously glass. When she finally sat back, her expression was grave but satisfied. The message was longer than she had thought. The twisted threads, followed by a minute drop stitch and a raised tally, formed not 1 letter but 3, D-E-R, half concealed beneath an overlying pin. D-E-R. She closed her eyes, letting the village roll through her mind like a familiar litany. Names, faces, old stories. Then she rose, wrapped the pillow carefully in tissue paper, and walked steadily back to Ivy Lane End. Sir Henry received it with raised eyebrows. Well? It is more than a warning, Miss Marple said quietly. It is an accusation, but it is not yet complete. Whoever interrupted Evelyn Threadgood did so in the very act of murder, and the lace still lacks its final clause. We are dealing with someone who understands lace-making well enough to recognize danger, yet not well enough to read the whole message. Sir Henry gave a low whistle. That narrows the field considerably. Indeed, said Miss Marple, and for the first time since the tragedy, her gentle face wore the faintest, most unladylike smile of anticipation. The false thread has been laid, Henry. Now we have only to wait for the murderer to pull it. Chapter 5. Knots in the Pattern. The days following the inquest settled into that peculiar hush that falls over a village when murder has been officially pronounced, yet no arrest follows. Doors were closed a fraction earlier. Curtains twitched more often, and conversations on garden paths stopped the instant a stranger appeared. Miss Marple, outwardly serene, moved through this uneasy quiet like a quiet-footed cat, accepting cups of tea, admiring new dahlias, and listening with the same gentle attention she gave to church sermons, so that people scarcely noticed how much they told her. On the 3rd afternoon, she sat in Emily Barton's tiny front room, the lace pillow from Ivy Lane End between them on a low table, its muslin cover removed. Emily, still pale but steadier, had been allowed to fetch the butterfly under Sir Henry's supervision, and now the two women bent over it in the golden light that slanted through the latticed window. Miss Marple's magnifying glass traveled slowly across the delicate web. "There," she said at last, indicating a place near the butterfly's body where 4 pins formed a minute square. "Do you see how the thread crosses itself here, Emily? That is not an accident. It is the old Flemish signal for 'look closer.' And beneath it," she adjusted the glass, 3 raised tallies, then a dropped stitch carried forward twice. In your teacher's private variation, that means the letter O. Emily's breath caught. D-E-O. She was trying to write a name. Or part of one, Miss Marple agreed. She knew she was being poisoned and had not strength for many words. So she used the only paper she trusted, the lace itself. Emily's eyes filled. Then the next letter would have told us everything. If only she had lived another hour. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on the girl's wrist. "Murderers are often in a hurry, my dear. That haste is their undoing." She asked then about the routine of the workroom. Who had wound fresh thread onto bobbins in recent weeks? Who had cleaned or sharpened pins? Who had access to the drawer where the arsenic-tipped ones were found? Emily answered readily. Only 3 people besides Mrs. Threadgood herself regularly handled the equipment. Emily, when she came for lessons 3 times a week, Lydia Croft, who had borrowed pins and bobbins on several occasions for comparison, and Dr. Haydock, who had called professionally every Tuesday to take Mrs. Threadgood's pulse, and while she rested would sometimes sit beside her as she worked, chatting to keep her mind from her heart. "Doctor was always so kind," Emily whispered. He would wind a bobbin for her if her fingers tired, and once when she pricked herself badly, he cleaned the pin with spirit himself. Miss Marple's gaze grew thoughtful. Spirit would remove ordinary dirt, but not perhaps a paste of arsenic applied earlier. From Emily's cottage, she walked to the surgery where Dr. Haydock received her in his consulting room with the slightly forced cheer of a man who has not slept well. The room smelled of carbolic and leather. On the desk lay a neat stack of accounts. He pushed them aside. "Jane, you will have heard the gossip. I want you to know there is nothing in it. Yes, I owed Evelyn money, £300 borrowed 2 years ago when my wife was ill. I have been paying it back steadily." She held the note, that is all. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Debts between friends are painful things, Doctor, especially when the lender begins to fear they will never be repaid." Haydock flushed. "She had started to press me lately, said she needed the capital for a bequest, but I would never—" He broke off, spreading his hands. "Good heavens, Jane, I have taken life in the course of duty, but only to ease pain, not like this." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, yet someone did, and someone who knew that repeated small pricks would escape notice where a single large dose would not." She left him looking shaken and continued to the churchyard, where the Reverend Leonard Dane Calthrop was tying up straying ramblers. He greeted her abstractedly. His mind was clearly on his sermon. Miss Marple admired the roses, then asked whether Mrs. Threadgood had ever spoken to him of forgiving a debt. The vicar looked startled. "Why, yes, last week. She said she had decided to cancel a certain obligation because resentment was a heavier burden than any sum of money." She seemed relieved, almost light-hearted. Miss Marple thanked him and walked on, her parasol twirling slowly. A debt forgiven, yet the lender dead within days. Curious timing. That evening Sir Henry Clithering called at Mead, accepting a small glass of sherry and refusing seed cake with the discipline of a man who watches his waistcoat buttons. He listened while Miss Marple recounted the day's discoveries, then laid a folded paper on the table. The county analyst's full report. The arsenic was mixed with fuller's earth to make a paste. It would adhere to pin tips without rubbing off on the fingers that applied it. And we have traced the purchase of the weed killer from which it came, sold to Miss Lydia Croft last March for the church paths, as she claimed. But the bottle in the shed was nearly full, and the gardener swears he used a different brand. Miss Marple considered. So the poison could have come from anywhere. A red herring neatly tied. Sir Henry smiled. You taught me that phrase, Jane. Now tell me, where does the true thread lead? Miss Marple unfolded the lace pillow's muslin and pointed to the incomplete message. D-E-O. The next letter will be on the upper wing, which remains to be worked. Whoever returns to this pillow hoping to alter or destroy the evidence will finish the name for us. Sir Henry's eyes gleamed. A trap, a very small one, Miss Marple said apologetically. But murderers are vain. They cannot bear to leave a story half told. They arranged it between them. The following morning, Emily, pale but composed, would let it be known at the post office that she intended to complete the butterfly as a tribute and would work on it each afternoon at Ivy Lane End. The cottage would be left unlocked during the hour she took her constitutional walk, long enough for curiosity to overcome caution. Sir Henry departed, and Miss Marple sat late by her fire, although the night was warm. In the quiet, she could almost hear the faint click of bobbins from a cottage now empty, the soft intake of breath as a murderess bent over deadly work. She thought of the many kinds of knots people tie, knots of greed, of fear, of wounded pride, and how easily in the end they may be undone by a single thread pulled gently in the right place. Upstairs in her bedroom, she opened the little drawer where she kept oddments, a thimble that had belonged to her mother, a faded dance card, a length of antique Valenciennes lace given her years ago by an old lady in a continental hotel. She took out the lace, laid it across her knee, and studied it until the pattern became words she had never seen before. Human nature, she reflected, is much the same in Valenciennes as in St. Mary Mead, only the patterns change. She slept at last, dreaming not of murder but of butterflies poised motionless above summer flowers, their wings trembling with messages no one had yet learned to read. Chapter 6. Unraveling Leads. The trap was set with all the innocent delicacy of a spider's web. Emily Barton, pale but resolute, spent each afternoon at Ivy Lane End, the lace pillow on its stand by the window, her fingers moving slowly across the unfinished butterfly while the village watched from behind net curtains and pretended not to. She worked only the outer edge of the upper wing, adding a few harmless stitches each day, careful never to approach the place where the next letter must appear. Constable Slack's young sergeant sat in the kitchen reading yesterday's newspaper, his boots planted solidly on the hearthrug, and every so often Emily offered him a cup of tea and a Marie biscuit so that no one could say the cottage was truly unguarded. Yet everyone in St. Mary Mead knew, by the mysterious process that needs no words, that the front door stood on the latch between 4 and 5:30, and that the sergeant was under strict orders not to be too officious. On the 4th afternoon, Miss Marple took up her position in the front bedroom of Mrs. Price Ridley's house opposite, armed with a pair of opera glasses borrowed from Dolly Bantry and a plate of Mrs. Price Ridley's excellent shortbread. Mrs. Price Ridley herself hovered in a fever of excitement, certain that the murderer would turn out to be a homicidal tramp who had hidden in the potting shed since Tuesday. Miss Marple, murmuring agreement in all the right places, kept her gaze fixed on the pink-washed cottage across the lane. At 4:20, a figure appeared at the gate. Lydia Croft, carrying a large reticule and walking with the brisk determination of a woman who has convinced herself she is merely collecting a forgotten reel of Silko. She glanced up and down the lane, saw nothing suspicious, and slipped inside. Through the window, Miss Marple watched her cross the sitting room in 3 strides, bend over the lace pillow, and then freeze as though someone had struck her. For a full minute she remained motionless. Then, very carefully, she lifted one pin, studied the threads beneath, and replaced it exactly as it had been. Her hand went to her throat. She backed away, looked once toward the kitchen door where the sergeant could be heard turning a page, and left as quietly as she had come. Mrs. Price Ridley was disappointed. "Only Lydia Croft. I told you it would be a tramp." Miss Marple lowered the glasses. "My dear, tramps do not know Flemish lace code. Miss Croft has just discovered that she is not as clever as she believed." That evening Sir Henry called again, his face graver than before. "Lydia Croft has been to the police station of her own accord. Denies everything, of course. Says she only went to fetch a pattern she lent Evelyn last year. But she was shaking like a leaf, and when the sergeant mentioned the twisted threads, she went white as paper." Miss Marple nodded. She thought the message spelled her own name, Lydia perhaps, or Croft. She came to see how much was finished. Finding it still incomplete, she dared not touch it further. Fear has made her honest for the moment. Sir Henry poured himself a small sherry. "Then she is innocent?" "Of the actual poisoning, I believe so. Of wishing Evelyn dead, never. Envy is a terrible thing, Henry. It eats holes in the soul as surely as moth in wool." The next day brought a different visitor. Dr. Haydox Morris drew up at the cottage just as Emily was leaving for her walk. The doctor went in openly, greeted the sergeant cheerfully, and spent 10 minutes in the sitting room collecting a book he had lent Mrs. Threadgood. When he emerged, his face was calm, but Miss Marple, watching from the same vantage point, noticed that he paused on the step to wipe his forehead with a handkerchief, though the afternoon was cool. Sir Henry received the report an hour later. "He moved 2 pins on the upper wing," the sergeant said, "then put them back exactly. Said afterwards he thought one thread looked loose and feared the work would unravel." Miss Marple received this news over tea at Gossington Hall, where Dolly Bantry was now convinced the doctor had poisoned half his patients and was only waiting for the churchyard to give him away. Miss Marple sipped quietly and said nothing until Dolly ran out of breath. "My dear," she murmured at last, "doctors are trained to notice when something is wrong. Dr. Haydock saw the message beginning to form the letters D and O, his own initials perhaps, or part of his surname. He wished to see how much Evelyn had managed before she died." Dolly's eyes grew round. "Then it is the doctor." "It is someone who believes it is the doctor," Miss Marple corrected gently. That night the trap sprang. At 25 minutes to 5, when the sergeant had been lured into the garden by Emily on the pretext of identifying Greenfly, a third figure slipped through the gate. Reginald Threadgood, collar turned up though the evening was mild, moved with the furtive haste of a man who has waited too long for his inheritance. He was inside less than 2 minutes. When he came out, his face was mottled with rage and fear. He almost ran down the lane, and did not notice Miss Marple standing in the shadow of the lilac bush. Sir Henry met her 10 minutes later in her own parlor. "Well?" Miss Marple laid 3 pins on the table. He pulled these out and tried to cut the thread beneath with his penknife. The sergeant heard the snip and challenged him. "Reginald claims he only wanted a souvenir of his aunt. But look, Henry, the thread he tried to destroy forms the next letter, R. The message now reads DEOR. Sir Henry stared at the delicate lace, then at Miss Marple. Deor? That is Old English for darling, or perhaps a name? Deirdre something? Or, Miss Marple said softly, it is the beginning of a word Evelyn Threadgood never lived to finish. Detor. The room was very quiet. Outside, a blackbird practiced its evening song, and somewhere a child called for its mother. Sir Henry set down his glass. Then the murderer is the person Mrs. Threadgood regarded as her debtor, the one whose debt she threatened to call in, or perhaps to expose. Miss Marple folded her hands. Exactly. And tomorrow the village fete opens. Everyone will be there. Doctor, nephew, Lydia Croft, Emily the vicar, half St. Mary Mead. The butterfly will be exhibited in the handicraft tent as a tribute. The upper wing remains blank, waiting for its final stitches. Our murderer knows that if the word is completed in public, the accusation will be plain for all to see. Sir Henry smiled, a slow, appreciative smile. And you propose to let the murderer try again, this time before witnesses. I propose, Miss Marple said, to give greed or fear or wounded pride one last chance to betray itself. After that, Henry, even Constable Slack will be able to make an arrest. She rose and went to the window. The long twilight was deepening into night. Across the fields, the first lights of the fete ground winked on, fairy bulbs strung between the maypoles. Somewhere among those lights walked a person who believed that one old woman's death had secured safety and gain. Miss Marple drew the curtain and turned back to the room, her small face serene. Evil is very powerful, she said quietly, but it is never as clever as it thinks. Tomorrow, Henry, we shall see whose hand trembles when the last knot is tied. Chapter 7. The Hidden Stitch. The morning of the fete dawned flawless, sky rinsed clean, air sweet with cut grass and the smoke of early bonfires. By 10 o'clock, the village green was already a cheerful riot of bunting and trestle tables, the brass band tuning up beside the coconut shy. Children darting between legs with sticky fingers and louder voices. In the handicraft tent, shaded by green canvas and smelling of lavender polish and warm serge, the lace exhibits were arranged on a baize-covered table beneath a placard that read, "In memory of Mrs. Evelyn Threadgood." At the center, on a small velvet stand of its own, rested the butterfly pillow, the unfinished wing, turned modestly toward the wall so that only the completed portion showed to the public. Emily Barton, in a new white frock and straw hat, stood guard beside it, pale but composed, while Miss Marple, in dove-gray silk and the lace scarf that had belonged to her grandmother, sat quietly on a folding chair just inside the tent flap, her knitting needles moving with meditative calm. Sir Henry Clithering, ostensibly admiring the prize marrows, kept the tent in view. Two plainclothes men from the county force, disguised as a cheerful couple on honeymoon, strolled hand in hand past the coconut shy every 7 minutes. Constable Slack, helmet gleaming, had been posted at the entrance with instructions to look impressive and ask no one for their ticket twice. The first hour passed peacefully enough. Villagers filed in, exclaimed over the beauty of the butterfly, sighed at the tragedy, and moved on. Lydia Croft arrived early, lips tight, deposited her own entry, a very creditable collar and buck's point, and left without a word. Dr. Haydock came next, correct in a light gray suit, complimented Emily on her courage, studied the lace for a long moment with an unreadable expression, and departed with a slight bow. Reginald Threadgood was seen at the beer tent by 11, already rather red about the eyes. At 12:30, the crowd thickened. The band struck up a selection from the Mikado, and the noise outside rose to a steady, cheerful roar. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside, slipped quietly behind the display table, and with a murmured apology to Emily turned the pillow so that the unfinished wing now faced outward. The blank space where the final stitches should lie was clearly visible, the pins waiting in their little cushion like silver soldiers. Emily, following instructions, announced in a clear voice to the group of ladies examining the jam, "I shall finish the last few stitches this afternoon, just as dear Mrs. Threadgood would have wished. It will be my tribute to her." The word spread faster than measles. Within minutes, the tent was crowded. Miss Marple resumed her seat, hands folded, eyes bright. At 10 minutes to 1, Dr. Haydock returned, this time alone. He moved through the press of people with the ease of a man used to being recognized and respected. Yet Miss Marple noticed the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead, though the tent was cool. He stopped before the butterfly, smiled at Emily, and said conversationally, "Brave of you, my dear, to complete it today of all days. May I watch? For old time's sake." Emily hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Of course, doctor. I was just about to begin." She sat, opened the small workbox at her feet, took out a bobbin wound with the exact shade of thread Mrs. Threadgood had used, and began to lay the first stitches across the empty space. Dr. Haydock stood behind her chair, one hand resting lightly on the table edge, the other in his pocket. Miss Marple watched the hand in the pocket. Emily worked slowly, deliberately. The first pair of stitches formed a simple cross. The second pair twisted once, then lay flat. The third pair, Miss Marple saw the doctor's fingers tighten on the table, began the distinctive half-stitch that would raise a tally. A murmur rose from the little knot of watchers. Someone recognized the Flemish beginning. At that moment, Reginald Threadgood pushed his way into the tent, face flushed with beer and alarm. "Here, what's this? You can't finish it. That lace is mine by rights." He lunged forward, knocking over a display of doilies. The doctor moved like lightning. His right hand came out of his pocket, clutching a pair of small surgical scissors, flashed downward toward the lace. Emily cried out. Reginald shouted. The crowd surged. But Miss Marple was already on her feet. With surprising strength for so frail a figure, she brought her parasol down smartly across the doctor's wrist. The scissors clattered to the ground. Sir Henry appeared as if by magic, one hand clamping Haydock's arm, the other signaling to his men. "I think, Doctor," he said pleasantly, "we had better continue this conversation elsewhere." For a moment the tent was pandemonium, screams, overturned chairs, a child beginning to cry. Then Constable Slack's voice boomed out, the crowd parted, and Dr. Haydock was led away between two detectives, his face suddenly old and gray. Reginald, sobered instantly, began to bluster that he had only wished to protect his property. Sir Henry assured him he would have every opportunity to explain at the station. When quiet was restored, Miss Marple stooped, picked up the scissors, and with infinite care cut the 3 stitches Emily had just laid. The thread sprang back, revealing the untouched ground beneath. She lifted the pillow so that all could see. There, formed by the faintest possible raising of the threads Mrs. Threadgood had managed in her last conscious moments, stood the completed word, "Detour." A sigh, half horror, half wonder, went round the tent. Emily began to weep silently. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It is finished," she said softly. "The lace has spoken as she knew it would." Later, in the cool of the vicarage drawing room, with the fete still roaring outside like a distant sea, Dr. Haydock made a full confession. The debt had begun innocently enough, money for his wife's treatment abroad, then grown as his investments failed. Mrs. Threadgood, kind at first, had become uneasy when he could not repay. A month ago she had threatened to expose him to the medical council, unless the money was returned by the end of summer. He had obtained arsenic from the surgery stores, mixed it with fuller's earth, and over several visits, while pretending to help with the bobbins, had coated a dozen pins. The pricks were tiny. She blamed her own clumsiness. When she began to suspect and started the coded message, he had called on the fatal evening, watched her drink the tea he had offered to steady her, and seeing her fingers falter, had realized the lace was accusing him. In panic, he had smashed the cup to confuse the symptoms and left her to die. "She forgave the debt the day before," he said bitterly. "Told the vicar she would cancel the note. If I had waited one more day, Miss Marple, pouring tea with a steady hand, completed the sentence he could not bring himself to utter. One more day, doctor, and an innocent woman would have lived, and you would have been free. Pride and fear are cruel jailers. Outside, the band played Land of Hope and Glory. Children shrieked with delight at the hoopla, and the sun poured down on St. Mary Mead as though no shadow had ever crossed it. The fete continued. The butterfly won its posthumous first prize, and by evening the village had begun to speak of the affair in the hushed, slightly thrilled tone reserved for legends. Only Miss Marple, walking home beneath the first stars, paused to look back at the gay lights and reflected that human hearts are fragile things, easily pricked, and that even the finest lace may carry, hidden in its knots, a cry for justice that will not be silenced. Chapter 8. Tightening the Weave. The village woke the next morning to a sky the color of washed china, and the subdued, almost reverent hush that follows the solving of a tragedy. Dr. Haydock had been taken to the county town the previous evening. His surgery stood shuttered, the brass plate already dulled, and a constable guarded the door while papers were removed in cardboard boxes. In the churchyard, the rambler roses nodded as usual over the graves, but the bell ringers practiced with unusual solemnity, as though the bells themselves were reluctant to disturb the air. Miss Marple, waking early as is the habit of the old, sat at her bedroom window with a cup of tea and watched the milkman's cart pass more slowly than usual, the horse pausing without being bidden opposite Ivy Lane End, as if even animals understood that something had ended there. By 10 o'clock, the vicarage drawing-room had become an informal court of explanation. Sir Henry Clithering, fresh from the police station, had accepted Mrs. Dane Calthrop's invitation to coffee and seed cake, and with him came Inspector Craddock from Scotland Yard, young, alert, and plainly delighted to be present at one of Miss Marple's triumphs. Dolly Bantry arrived breathless, Colonel Bantry in tow for once, and Emily Barton, still white-faced but calmer, was persuaded to join them. The vicar hovered anxiously with the coffee pot, while his wife, tall and untidy and beaming, pressed cake upon everyone as though sugar could sweeten the taste of yesterday's horror. Sir Henry began without ceremony. Haydock signed a full statement at dawn. The debt was larger than he admitted to you, Jane. Nearly £800, borrowed in stages over 3 years. His investments in a private nursing home collapsed. He was facing ruin and disgrace. Mrs. Threadgood had been patient at first, then uneasy, finally resolute. She told him on the Tuesday that unless the money was repaid by Michaelmas, she would inform the medical council of the circumstances. Not to ruin him, she said, but to protect other patients. He saw prison, or at the very least the end of his practice. Miss Marple nodded. She was a just woman, not a vindictive one. But she had waited long enough. Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook. He coated the pins during 4 separate visits, using a paste of arsenic and fuller's earth mixed in a watchmaker's oil cup. Very fine work, almost undetectable. He chose pins she was certain to use on the butterfly because it was the piece she worked on most evenings. On the fatal night, he called ostensibly to bring her a new bottle of digitalis. She let him in herself. He made her a cup of tea while she rested, watched her drink it, and then, this is the coldest part, sat chatting while she grew drowsy. When she began to fumble with the lace and he realized she was trying to leave a message, he encouraged her to finish her tea to steady the hand. The cup falling was the last thing she knew. Emily gave a small, heartbroken sound. Dolly Bantry reached across and pressed her hand. Sir Henry continued. He staged the scattered bobbins to suggest a seizure, broke the cup to confuse the symptoms, arsenic can mimic heart failure very convincingly, and left by the back door, which he bolted behind him. The front latch was always left for the daily help, so no forced entry. He believed the slow poisoning would be put down to accidental contamination from the weed killer in the shed. A clever plan, but for 2 things. Mrs. Threadgood's extraordinary presence of mind and Miss Marple's knowledge of lacemaker's code. All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who sat very straight in her chair, the morning light catching the silver of her hair. "It was never complicated," she said quietly. "Evelyn Threadgood knew she was dying and by whose hand. She had not strength for many letters, so she used the language she trusted most. The twisted threads formed D-E-B-T-O-R, debtor. She managed the first 4 letters before consciousness failed. The final 2 were hidden under pins she never had time to work. I knew the code from an old lacemaker in Bruges many years ago. Evelyn had refined it, but the principle was the same. Once I saw the deliberate irregularity, the rest followed." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "But dash it all, why didn't she simply write the man's name on a piece of paper?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, Colonel, she was an artist. Paper can be destroyed, burned, denied. Lace once pinned and worked is almost impossible to alter without leaving scars. She knew that whoever examined her work after her death would see the message and that it would endure. She was leaving her testimony in the medium she loved best." There was a respectful silence. Outside, the church clock struck 11, clear and tranquil. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook. Haydock tried to destroy the evidence twice, once at the cottage, once at the fete. Each time he betrayed himself further. The scissors he carried yesterday still had a trace of the same fuller's earth paste on the blade. He had meant to cut out the entire section of net if necessary. Emily spoke for the first time, her voice trembling but steady. She forgave the debt the day before she died. The vicar witnessed the cancellation. If he had only waited. Sir Henry's face was grim. He learned of the forgiveness too late. The vicar mentioned it to him casually yesterday morning, an hour after he had been arrested. Haydock wept, said over and over that one more day would have saved them both. Mrs. Dane Calthrop set down the coffee pot with a small clink. "Pride," she said simply. "Pride and fear. The old sins." Miss Marple looked toward the window where sunlight lay in quiet bars across the carpet. Pride made him borrow beyond his means, fear made him kill to hide it. And in the end, neither pride nor fear could silence a few twists of thread. There is a lesson there, I think, though not a comfortable one. Dolly Bantry, who had been unusually silent, suddenly burst out, "But the village. Poor Dr. Haydock, everyone trusted him. Who will look after us now?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Someone else will come, Dolly dear. Doctors do. And we shall trust again because we must. St. Mary Mead has survived wars and epidemics and more than one scandal. It will survive this." The party broke up soon afterward. Sir Henry walked Miss Marple home through the sunny lanes, the two of them moving slowly like old friends who need few words. "You were brilliant, Jane," he said at her gate. "The lace trap at the fete. Perfect." Miss Marple shook her head. "Not brilliant, Henry, only patient. Murder is noisy, truth is quiet. One has only to listen." He smiled, saluted, and left her. She stood a moment watching the street settle back into its familiar rhythm. The baker's van, a child bowling a hoop, Mrs. Blade at the post office shaking her mat. Nothing appeared changed, yet everything was. A man who had been trusted had betrayed that trust in the worst way imaginable, and the village would carry the scar for years. Inside her little house, Miss Marple removed her hat, smoothed her hair, and went to the sitting-room window. On the table lay the butterfly lace, returned that morning by the police, now framed under glass as the coroner had directed. She studied it for a long time, the delicate wings, the tiny, deliberate knots that spelled accusation and testament. Then very gently she turned the frame to the wall. "Rest now, Evelyn," she whispered. "Your work is done." Outside, a breeze stirred the roses and set the lace curtains trembling like fragile wings. The pattern was complete, the weave tightened, and St. Mary Mead, bruised but unbowed, prepared to go on living. Chapter 9. The Revelation. The revelation did not come in the vicarage drawing room, nor in the police station, nor even under the green canvas of the handicraft tent, but in the quiet of Miss Marple's own parlor at 4:30 on the afternoon following the fete, with the sun slanting golden through the French windows and the air full of the scent of sweet williams from her garden. Only 5 people were present: Sir Henry Clithering, Inspector Craddock, Dolly Bantry, who had insisted on being included because someone must represent the village, Emily Barton, and Miss Marple herself, who had asked that the butterfly lace still in its temporary frame be brought from the police station and laid upon her small mahogany table. Tea had been poured, seed cake declined by everyone except Dolly, who declared that shock always made her hungry, and then Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap like a small gray bird settling its feathers, began to speak in her soft, precise voice that somehow compelled absolute silence. "You will want to know," she said, "exactly how the pattern was woven, for patterns matter even when they are made of terrible things. Let us go back to the beginning, to the moment Evelyn Threadgood realized she was being poisoned. She was old, her heart was weak, but her mind was as clear as winter water. She understood that the tiny pricks she had blamed on carelessness were deliberate, that the pins themselves carried death, and that the person who had access to those pins, who sat beside her on Tuesday afternoons winding bobbins while she rested, was the only person who could have done it. She forgave the debt on the Thursday, meaning to tell him on the Friday, but by Friday evening she was already too ill, and pride, his pride, had kept him away until it was too late. Sir Henry nodded. He admitted as much this morning, said he had meant to call on the Friday but could not bring himself to face her kindness after what he had done. Miss Marple inclined her head. So on the fatal evening he came, bringing the new bottle of digitalis as an excuse. She let him in, grateful for company. He made her tea. She had not the strength to do it herself, and while the kettle boiled he watched her fingers falter over the lace and saw the first letters forming. D-E-B-T. Panic seized him. He urged her to drink the tea quickly, son, to steady the hand. And when she slipped into unconsciousness, he scattered the bobbins, broke the cup to suggest a heart attack, and left by the bolted back door, believing the slow poisoning would be attributed to accident. Dolly gave a little shiver. How cold-blooded. Not cold, Dolly dear, Miss Marple corrected gently. Desperate. There is a difference, though not one that comforts the victim, but Evelyn was not quite finished. In the last moments before the final dose took hold, she managed 2 more letters, O and R, and placed pins over the place where the final proof would lie. She knew that whoever understood lace would read the word debtor, and that the only debtor she had was the man who had sat beside her week after week pretending friendship while he murdered her. Emily's eyes were fixed on the framed butterfly. She used her art to accuse him even after death. Art and truth, Miss Marple said. She trusted both. Inspector Craddock leant forward. But the pins tested positive for arsenic, and Haydock had access to arsenic in the surgery. Why did we ever doubt it? Because, Miss Marple answered, doubt is the beginning of wisdom. Dr. Haydock was clever, but not clever enough to invent a method unknown to medical literature. Slow poisoning by coated pins has been tried before, though rarely with lace pins. He was also vain. He believed that if the lace were destroyed, the accusation would die with it. That is why he came to the cottage twice, why he carried scissors to the fete. Each time he betrayed himself further. The vain murderer always returns to the scene, Inspector, if only to make sure his work is admired. Sir Henry smiled faintly. And the trap at the fete? A small thing, Miss Marple said deprecatingly. Emily laid 3 innocent stitches that began the next letter, an H, had they been finished. Dr. Haydock saw the word taking shape as Debtor H, and believed his name was about to appear in full. He could not bear it. The scissors were meant to cut away the evidence, but they cut away his freedom instead. Dolly set down her cup with a clatter. But the message was already complete. Why did he not see that? Because, Miss Marple said, turning the frame so that the light fell full upon the lace. He did not truly understand the code. He knew a little, enough to recognize danger, but not enough to read the whole. The final R was hidden beneath a raised tally so delicate that only a lace maker would see it. To Dr. Haydock it looked unfinished. To Emily, to me, to any true practitioner, the word stood complete. Debtor. Evelyn Threadgood had finished her testimony after all. Emily began to cry quietly. Miss Marple reached across and touched her hand. She left you the patterns, my dear, and the tools and the knowledge. That was her real forgiveness, not of the debt, but of the frailty that led to murder. She wanted the craft to go on, untainted. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. A remarkable woman, and a remarkable piece of evidence. The lace will be produced at the trial, I take it? Sir Henry nodded. Under glass. The judge will need a magnifying glass, but the letters are unmistakable. It will be the first time, I believe, that a murder has been solved by Flemish lace code. Dolly looked as though she might faint from pride in her village. St. Mary Mead will never be the same. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her old friend with affectionate amusement. My dear Dolly, St. Mary Mead is always the same, only the patterns change. Greed, fear, wounded pride, these threads are woven through every village, every heart. Sometimes they make a tragedy, sometimes only a cautionary tale. Our task is to notice when the twist is wrong, and if we can, to pull the thread gently until the knot comes free. She rose and went to the window. Across the lane the gardens lay peaceful in the late sunshine. A tabby cat slept on a wall, and somewhere a child practiced scales on a piano. Nothing outwardly had altered. Dr. Haydock will be taken to trial, she said quietly, and very likely will spend the rest of his life in prison. His wife will leave the district. The surgery will have a new plate, and in time people will speak of him only in lowered voices. But the lace will remain, framed perhaps in the vicarage or the Women's Institute, a butterfly with a deadly message hidden in its wings. And those who understand will remember that even the most delicate things can carry the weight of truth. Sir Henry stood. You should write it all down, Jane. The case of the lace-making clue. Miss Marple smiled, the small, secret smile that belonged to herself alone. Perhaps I shall, Henry, though I think the lace has already written it more eloquently than I ever could. The little party broke up soon afterwards. Dolly bore Emily off to Gossington for sherry and consolation. The 2 policemen departed for the station and paperwork. And Miss Marple, alone in her quiet room, lifted the framed butterfly and held it to the light one last time. The threads gleamed like spun moonlight, and in their delicate intersections she read not only accusation but absolution. The forgiveness of an artist who knew that human beings are frail, and that even in dying she could leave behind something beautiful. She set the frame upon the mantelpiece where the sun would never fade it, and went to draw the curtains against the dusk. Outside, the first star pricked the sky above St. Mary Mead, and somewhere a church bell began to ring for evensong, clear and calm and enduring. The pattern was complete, the revelation spoken, and the village, scarred but whole, prepared to sleep. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Reflections. A week later, on a morning so still that the dew had not yet lifted from the grass, Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table with the French windows open to the garden, and the scent of late roses drifting in like a benison. The village had begun to heal in the way villages do. slowly on the surface, quickly underneath. The shutters were off the surgery door. A young doctor from Much Benham had already been to tea with the vicar. Children no longer crossed the road to avoid Ivy Lane End. And the framed butterfly lace now hung in the Women's Institute Hall beneath a small brass plate that read simply, "In memory of Evelyn Threadgood, 1875-1952. Gift of Miss Emily Barton." The newspapers had come and gone, taking their photographs and their headlines, and St. Mary Mead, relieved to find itself famous for only a fortnight, had settled back into its familiar rhythm of gossip, gardening, and gentle malice. Dolly Bantry arrived first, pink-cheeked from cycling and carrying a paper bag that smelled of warm Eccles cakes. Emily Barton followed 10 minutes later, her step lighter than it had been since spring, clutching a parcel wrapped in white tissue. They found Miss Marple pouring tea with the serene precision of a priestess at an altar, the spode cups arranged exactly as they had been on the morning the news first broke. "I had to come," Dolly announced, sinking into the best armchair and fanning herself with her hat. "Colonel Bantry says if I mention the word lace once more, he will take the next train to Scotland and not come back until the trout are rising. But really, Jane, one must talk." Emily smiled shyly and laid her parcel on the table. "I finished it," she said, unfolding the tissue. Inside lay a square of lace so delicate it seemed made of moonlight and air, a fine Honiton sprig with a border of butterflies no larger than a thumbnail. "I worked it from one of Mrs. Threadgood's old patterns. She always said if I could master the butterfly, I would be ready to teach. I thought we might hang it beside the other one as an answer." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "An answer indeed, my dear. Accusation on one wall, forgiveness on the other. That is how life should be balanced." Dolly peered at the new lace and gave a little crow of delight. "It's perfect. And no poisonous messages hidden in it, I trust?" "None," Emily said, coloring. "Only butterflies. They are free to fly." They drank their tea in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the clink of spoons and the distant bleat of a lamb from the water meadows. Outside, a robin sang from the apple tree with the proprietorial air of a bird that has never known tragedy. Presently, Dolly set down her cup. "Do you know, Jane, I still can't quite believe it was the doctor. He brought all my children into the world, set the colonel's leg when he fell off that horse in '39, sat up all night with poor Mrs. Harmon when she had pneumonia, and all the time, Miss Marple finished gently, he was a man who had made one mistake and could not bear to admit it. Pride, Dolly dear. Pride is a colder killer than greed. Greed wants. Pride refuses to be shamed. Dr. Haydock could have confessed the debt, asked for time, accepted help. Instead, he chose silence, and silence grew into murder." Emily looked up. "She forgave him, you know. The day before she died, she told the vicar the debt was cancelled. If he had only come to her, then—" Miss Marple poured a little more tea, watching the steam curl like lace itself. "If only is the saddest phrase in any language. But we are not given to live our lives backwards. Evelyn Threadgood understood that. She forgave, but she also warned. The lace was both mercy and judgment. She knew the truth must out, even if mercy came too late to save either of them." Dolly reached for another Eccles cake and spoke through crumbs. "Sir Henry says the trial will be in October. He thinks Haydock will plead guilty to spare the village more talk. Poor man. He looked 20 years older when they took him away." "Guilt ages us faster than time," Miss Marple observed. "But the village will forgive in its own way. We always do. We shall speak of him less and less and in softer voices until one day someone will say, 'There was a doctor here once, very good with children.' And no one will quite remember why he left." Emily folded her lace carefully back into its tissue. I have decided to stay on at the cottage. The vicar has arranged for me to give lessons, Tuesdays and Thursdays. The little ones are already begging to learn butterflies. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Then Evelyn's true legacy begins. Not the accusation, but the craft. Patterns handed on, generation after generation, each stitch a small act of creation. That is how we defeat death, my dear, by making something that outlasts it. Dolly leaned forward confidentially. And what about Reginald Threadgood? I hear he has gone back to London and is selling insurance. The will was perfectly clear, everything to the cottage and contents, then to Emily. He didn't get a penny. Greed punished itself, Miss Marple said. He will spend the rest of his life counting what he might have inherited if he had been patient. A heavier sentence in its way than prison. The church clock struck 11, its notes floating across the gardens like a benediction. Dolly rose reluctantly. I must go. The colonel is threatening to mow the lawn himself if I don't return soon, and the last time he tried, he took the heads off all my best delphiniums. Emily stood too, smoothing her dress. Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. I was so afraid at first, but now I think I understand what she wanted me to learn, not just lace, courage. Miss Marple accompanied them to the gate, her small figure neat in the sunlight. She watched them go, Dolly wobbling slightly on her bicycle, Emily walking with new purpose toward Ivy Lane End, and then turned back to the house. In the parlor, she paused before the mantelpiece where a small, empty space still waited. She took from a drawer a tiny square of lace she had worked herself in the quiet evenings of the past week, a single white rose, flawless and serene, and pinned it gently above the fireplace. There, she said aloud to the empty room, forgiveness on one side, creation on the other, and truth in the middle as it always must be. She moved to the window and stood looking out at the familiar view. The thatched roofs, the church tower, the roses nodding over her own gate. Nothing had changed, and everything had. A woman had died, a murderer had been unmasked, a craft would continue. The pattern was complete. Miss Marple smiled, a small, secret, satisfied smile, and went to wind the grandfather clock that had belonged to her father. The day stretched ahead, full of small, ordinary tasks, letters to write, scones to bake, perhaps a visit to the vicarage to discuss the autumn flower rota. Life in St. Mary Mead went on, as gentle and as dangerous as ever, stitched together by threads of kindness and malice, memory and hope. And somewhere in the Women's Institute Hall, two pieces of lace hung side by side, one bearing a hidden word of accusation, the other a flight of silent butterflies, reminding anyone who looked closely that even the finest fabric is only as strong as the heart that wove it, and that in every village, beneath the roses and the teacups and the polite good mornings, the great human comedy and tragedy play on, stitch by careful stitch, until the last knot is tied and the pattern is revealed.